All right, before going into the history leading up to the war and whether or not U.S. intervention was optimal in some sort of gruesome blood math analysis, let's just debunk the myth that the atomic bomb or an invasion was necessary to secure the defeat or secure the surrender of Japan. And I found an excellent little article from the Institute of Historical Review that likes to go into these, that likes to gore these sacred cows. And if How the World Works makes a video response, I'll probably find more sources and stuff like that. But for now, this article here has a great rundown on kind of like the basic main pieces of evidence against using the atomic bomb. This is just a quote from the article that I found most enlightening. I'll link to the article so you can read the whole thing. Anyway, the article says, just starting a little bit through, it was only after the war that the American public learned about Japan's efforts to bring the conflict to an end. Chicago Tribune reporter Walter Trohan, for example, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, was obliged by wartime censorship to withhold for 7 months one of the most important stories of the war. Okay, so this was back in January. In an article that finally appeared August 19th, 1945, on the front page of the Chicago Tribune and the Washington Times Herald, Trohan revealed that on January 20th, 1945, 2 days prior to his departure for the Yalta meeting with Stalin and Churchill, President Roosevelt received a 40-page memorandum from General Douglas MacArthur outlining 5 separate surrender overtures from high-level Japanese officials. Now, what are high-level Japanese officials? The emperor, sergeant. What's high-level? Not sure. I'd have to dig a little bit deeper to figure out who was actually sending these surrender overtures. Continues. This memo showed that the Japanese were offering surrender terms virtually identical to the ones ultimately accepted by the Americans at the formal surrender ceremony on September 2nd. That is, complete surrender of everything but the person of the emperor. Specifically, the terms of these peace overtures included 1. Complete surrender of all Japanese forces and arms at home, on island possessions, and in occupied countries. 2. Occupation of Japan and its possessions by Allied troops under American direction. 3. Japanese relinquishment of all territory seized during the war, as well as Manchuria, Korea, and Taiwan, which Japan had prior to the war. 4. Regulation of Japan had Manchuria, Korea, and Taiwan prior to the war. 4. Regulation of Japanese industry to halt production of any weapons and other tools of war. So, it's not just weapons, it's also tools of war, so that's that could be interpreted rather broadly. 5. Release of all prisoners of war and internees. And 6. Surrender of designated war criminals. Who is designated as a war criminal? Well, I assume that would be determined by military tribunal, which was done in the International Far East something tribunal. Anyway, article continues. Is this memorandum authentic? It was supposedly leaked to Trohan by Admiral William Leahy, Presidential Chief of Staff. William Leahy was a Presidential Chief of Staff and also an admiral. Okay. Historian Harry Elmer Barnes has related in an article on the National Review, May 10th, 1958. The article was titled Hiroshima, Assault on a Beaten Foe. Barnes writes, quote, "The authenticity of the Trohan article was never challenged by the White House or the State Department, and for very good reason. After General MacArthur returned from Korea in 1951, his neighbor in the Waldorf Towers, former President Herbert Hoover, took the Trohan article to General MacArthur, and the latter confirmed its accuracy in every detail without qualification." Okay. So General MacArthur confirms these 6 points. And then continue just some stuff that I found elsewhere. Here's a quote from Admiral William Leahy. Where did I find this? I should have said where I found it. Anyway, Admiral William Leahy apparently said, "It is in my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effective sea blockade and the successful bombing with conventional weapons." Close quote. And then a quote from Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He says, "The Japanese had, in fact, already sued for peace." Okay, so Chester Nimitz knew this. "The atomic bomb played no decisive part from a purely military point of view in the defeat of Japan." And then here's something I found somewhere. I don't know if this was from IHR or what. It says, "Norman Cousins was a consultant to General MacArthur during the American occupation of Japan. Cousins writes of his conversations with MacArthur, quote, MacArthur's views about the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were starkly different from what the general public supposed," close quote. He continues, quote, "I asked General MacArthur about the decision to drop the bomb, and I was surprised to learn that he had not even been consulted." Okay. "What," I asked, "would his advice have been?" He replied that he saw no military justification for dropping the bomb. The war might have ended weeks earlier. Okay. He said if the United States had agreed, as it later did anyway, to the retention of the institution of the emperor. Now, I would contend that it would have been closer to 7 months, maybe 5 months, but whatever. Needless to say, the bomb did not need to be dropped, but I would say that the last, 5 months or so of war could have been avoided. When was the Battle of Okinawa? Yeah, I think perhaps the Battle of Okinawa and Iwo Jima could have been avoided. Anyway, now I think some people find the idea that their state that they live under and the law that creates the laws that they have to live under that are enforced in a rather absolute manner and in a way that ignorance of the law is no excuse. That people who live under this thing that is so absolute, I think they find it difficult to swallow that this institution could do something so transparently and unnecessarily brutal. Although that number is becoming less and less as information becomes more available. Remember, like Roosevelt is the guy who thought it was a good idea to pay farmers to destroy crops in what was called a depression and legally enforce price floors. Right, that is, and that's what happened under the NRA. That is, if a shop wanted to sell you bread at, I don't know, I'm just making up numbers, 10 cents a loaf. That could be illegal if the industry-wide price floor was set at 12 cents a loaf. And this was during like really hard times when people were scraping to get by. All right, the NRA had said you have to sell it at 12 cents a loaf, not 10 cents a loaf. Right, pretty psychotic stuff. And it led to a lot of underground markets, as always happens when people do things like that. Anyway, so that's the kind of guy Roosevelt is. And look at the Bush and Obama bailouts, Bush's wars and Obama's escalation. And keep in mind, which is a story the public wants to believe? That the war could have been over in the Pacific perhaps as early as February of 1945 or not? The argument that the Japanese were going to fight until the end and that the atomic bomb was a humane action justified the fighting at the end of the war. Because if they were told, oh yeah, all those people who died in the final 7 months, they were not necessary. They could have been sent home months earlier, and those that died in those months, they wouldn't have needed to die. That's not something that people are going to take to very readily. So, and that's one reason I believe that there hasn't been a whole lot of skepticism on the dropping of the atomic bomb. I mean, there's been some, but not enough. Anyway, the rape of Nanking, which How the World Works brought up, occurred between December of 1937 and January 1938. I'm sure the exact dates are easy to come by. I think the Japanese captured Nanking. I think the battle between the Nationalist Army started on December 13, and the Japanese had won by December 17. But I forget when the city was evacuated and declared in order, and the army left the city and it transitioned over into like military civilian rule, or like civil military jurisdiction in January of 1938. Anyway, the International Military Tribunal of the Far East estimated the deaths at Nanking at 260,000. It is my opinion that this is an exaggeration based on the various exaggerations, based on who was conducting the trial and the incentives they had to inflate the numbers. Right? It's just victors writing the history, similar to the incentives of those conducting the Nuremberg trials. But that's a whole topic in and of itself, as I'm sure many people already know. But even if we assume that that number, 260,000, is accurate, the massacre was not sanctioned by Tokyo. The commander of that operation in Nanking was recalled, and he was never placed in a combat post ever again. And certainly the Japanese general population did not endorse that atrocity or anything like that on a smaller scale. So How the World Works is charged that the Japanese were, doing this stuff. Well, sort of. Like, some Japanese troops out in the field did stuff like that, right? And kind of like this. I don't want to get into the psychology of Japan and how, but basically Japan is like at the time Japan was, I would say Japan is generally quote more primitive, close quote, psychologically, kind of like Europeans were in, say, the early 1800s is what I would say, and that there was like early 1800 psychology with modern weaponry is how I would put it. Anyway, furthermore, did U.S. entry into the war actually result in less deaths in China? Remember, China was engaged in a civil war between 1928 and 1936, which resulted in over 2 million military killed. And this was before Japan entered. Between 1937 and 1945, the years Japan was waging war in China, there were between 3 and 4 million military killed. And these are soldiers, these are combatants. Now, of course, there were about 20 million Chinese people killed in combat between 1937 and 1945, the majority of them civilians. Between 16 and 17 million civilians were killed. And so I would estimate that about half as many total Chinese died between 1928 and 1936, and about as many died between 1945 and 1949 as died between 1928 and 1936. So it's not like... So the Japanese invasion of Japan certainly accelerated the death rate in China, but it's not like China was peaceful and then Japan, out of the blue, invaded and war started. War was going on for a long time, and then Japan entered, and the alliances in China shifted in order to deal with the new Japanese threat. The Japanese plan was to take over China, and China was going to be their empire. Japan was going to be like Britain, the island nation with the empire, and they were racially superior to the other people and destined to rule over these people, yada yada yada. And once taken over, I'm of the opinion that China would have been better off than they ended up being under Mao. Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria were all controlled by Japan, and the Japanese weren't engaging in atrocities in these established occupied areas, right? That is, in the established Japanese empire, Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria, the Japanese soldiers weren't going around hacking people up, right? The atrocities only occurred during the process of conquest itself. That is, atrocities weren't being carried out after conquest, right, or after martial government has been imposed on the population. And so the argument could be made that the intervention of the U.S. in World War II prevented the Japanese from taking over China, and so prolonged the war in China. Furthermore, it weakened the nationalists enough to where, with Soviet support, Mao was able to defeat the nationalists and implement his psychotic agricultural and industrial policies, which killed between 50 and 70 million people. Now, it's hard to directly say how many died as a result of Mao's policies, so that's why there's a wide variation there. Because people die of malnutrition. Well, is that because of Mao's policies? Well, Mao's policies led to a higher prevalence of malnutrition, but could you really say he died because of... So there's a little bit of ambiguity there. But 50 and 70 million, that's a decent range. Whereas if the Japanese had won in China, we would expect the Chinese to be treated like the Koreans were treated, right? As second-class citizens in a heavily regulated, privileged, and controlled quasi-market economy, like very far from a free market, but quasi-market, highly fascistic, highly cartelized, lots of cronyism, with the zaibatsus and stuff, right? And that's it's not the best thing in the world to be a second-class citizen in a kind of shitty economic system, but it's definitely better than Mao. So if your concern is over the total number of people killed, or even concern over the general well-being of, people, net happiness or something like that, then U.S. intervention probably resulted in worse. It probably resulted in more deaths in China than if they had just let Japan conquer it. Right? Because let me put it this way. U.S. intervention in World War II, invasion of Japan, guess what? It didn't prevent the rape of Nanking, right? Like, that happened, and the invasion of Japan did not prevent that from happening. And I would say that more deaths occurred in China as a result of that war being prolonged as opposed to a quick victory. An example of this would be like, the German invasion of France just blew over France, whereas the German invasion of the Soviet Union lasted for a long period of time. You had multiple rounds of troops being sent, multiple rounds of drafting going on. So it's if your interest is in saving lives, a quick victory is better than a prolonged war. And on... And anyway, the thing about the rape of Nanking is kind of hollow because on July 26th, 1940, the U.S. government passed the Export Control Act, which cut oil, iron, and steel imports to Japan. Right, and this was 2 years after the Nanking incident. Actually, like 2 years and 6 months after the Nanking incident. So the Nanking incident was not the catalyst for the embargo. Something else was the catalyst for the embargo in 1940. My guess would be that it was actually Hitler was the catalyst for the embargo, and that is they wanted to, neutralize Japan because Britain was preoccupied with Germany, and so, the U.S. wanted to stop allowing materials being sent to Japan to prevent Japan from being able to pounce on British territories in Asia. In July of 1941, the U.S. imposed a complete oil embargo of Japan. And now this is big. They're saying stuff can't go in from anywhere. Right? Now let me clarify my position before saying what I'm about to say. Using force to prevent the shipment of goods to another country is an act of war between states. Now, I'm not a fan of states. I think states are illegitimate by most people's standards of legitimacy, but it is an act of war between states. Now, you may say that the war on Japan was justified, and I will, of course, contend that it was not. But make no mistake, the war between the United States and Japan, in that war, right, between the two, not talking about China, right, not talking about Vietnam or Indonesia, right, we're talking about the United States and Japan. In that conflict, the United States was the aggressor. And the Japanese waited roughly 4 months before deciding to attack Pearl Harbor, right, which they had to do because their military needed oil and rubber, which they could get from Southeast Asia, but they needed to knock out the U.S. fleet. Otherwise, the U.S. fleet was going to get down in there and cause a whole lot of havoc. And so they wanted to knock it out quickly, but they weren't able to because the carriers were out of there, and yada, yada, yada. The notion that the Japanese people were monsters and would never surrender, that's a faulty perception, and it came from their almost religious devotion to the emperor. But the thing is, it was just that. Japanese soldiers captured by Americans routinely volunteered to fight with the Americans, because to surrender meant that you were disowned from Japan. So when a Japanese soldier surrendered to the Americans, they basically said, well, I can't go back to Japan, so I'm going to, I might as well join the Americans now. Right? That's what it's meant. And that's why they fought so hard. Not because they were fanatics per se, but because of the structure of Japan. If the Japanese government officially surrendered, the population would obediently obey the dictates and surrender as well. And this is not speculation. Because that is exactly what happened once the state surrendered. Once the state surrendered, the population followed because of their very strong belief in the state and their strong obedience to the state. The general population was not going to fight against the Americans in opposition to the emperor's wishes, right, which they didn't. And lastly, he said this collectivism is nuts, and it kind of annoyed me. All throughout this, I'm speaking like the Japanese did X, Y, and Z. And that's a falsehood, but it's a falsehood that I'm saying for the sake of simplicity. Ideally, we would only speak in the language of individual human action. But Lee Doran seems to be taking these states as seriously as the leaders of the governments take these states. That is, he's taking these states like he's anthropomorphizing Japan, right? As like treating, Japan did this. They were responsible for this action and they need to be punished, right? So, the Japanese state, which many individuals believed in and supported, commanded them to do insane things. It's not like a bunch of Japanese people all just got together in a meeting and decided to go pick up their rifles and spontaneously start building battleships and aircraft carriers and land troops in China and all that stuff. No, that all came from a presupposition of state authority. Individuals in each of these monstrous things we call states are victims. They were all trapped, and no individual had a choice. And each individual was trained from an early age to obey certain authorities, and no one of them could have possibly resisted it. So no, the Japanese people were victims of their own collective pathology, that is, the belief in states. And lastly, just keep in mind, there are more Japanese deaths per capita in World War II than Chinese deaths.